Arthur Levine. He's the president of the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. I don't know if they still call it the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation.
Indeed, we do.
Yeah, still do. And before that, of course, he was the president of Teachers College up in New York. Many of you may have read his work before. He's done a number of studies. One of my favorite books is still Beating the Odds, back from 1996, where he followed, I think, 24 students. It seems like a lifetime ago. Is that what you're
At least a lifetime ago.
Yeah. But the issues in that book are still relevant today in terms of, it's a bit of a lottery on how you do in life, at least in America. And that brings us to our topic. Earlier, or I guess last year, we released, and you can't see it probably, but right behind you is Finding Superman. I was very fortunate to edit this book, and Dr. Levine had one of the chapters in it. I'm going to ask him to talk a little bit in a moment about what he wrote and his thoughts about it. The genesis of this book was based on the documentary by Davis Guggenheim called Waiting for Superman. Now, who in the audience has seen that documentary? Wow, that's a pretty good group. It's funny, it didn't do very good at the box office. I watched that movie. I've really liked his previous works. He, of course, did the nice piece with Al Gore that won an Academy Award, An Inconvenient Truth. And then he did a really fabulous but quirky documentary called It Might Get Loud with Jimmy Page, not Bono, but The Edge, guitarist, and Jack White, which was really interesting, but kind of a little off what he usually does. But he's a great filmmaker, and he created this movie, Waiting for Superman, which of course followed, I believe it was five families, and looked at kind of what happened to them. Making I guess the thesis of it is, of course, that we're not doing enough, that kids are failures because of society, and that public schools aren't engaging them well enough. So there's some constituency out there that believes that the piece was a bit of a promo for charter schools, and I think it is. I've been an evaluator of charter schools, and there's things I like about them, there's things I don't like about them, but I can say pretty similarly about public schools as well. Well, when I got this idea, I said, well, why don't we write something that gives experts an opportunity to say what they think about the movie. So we had Linda Darling-Hammond, Dr. Levine, Milton Chen of Edutopia, which was sponsored by the George Lucas Foundation, Dan Domenech of AASA, John Merrow of PBS, and others that I'm surely forgetting right now. And we put together this really, really nice piece with the various perspectives on it. Now, there was some criticism on the book, and the criticism was it leans to the left for some reason, which was interesting because the design was absolutely not to do that. And I just had to write an op-ed for a journal, as they did a book review, and it was a charter school journal. And they said how left-leaning it was, and it's too bad it's absent of any right thinking on it. They said right, not correct, right. And the argument, the problem I had with that is that we invited all these others to actually write chapters, including Michelle Reed, Davis Guggenheim, Jeffrey Canada, and many others, and they all said no. Even some of those that originally agreed ended up saying, no, I don't think I'm going to do it. So it's disappointing. That said, I still think it was a balanced and fair book, and we'll talk more about it. I got a few things I want to say about my chapter on it, but if it's okay, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Levine to talk about some of his theses in the book.
Fair enough. Good afternoon, everybody. I can't see any of you. The lights are so bright, but I can hear your voices. So as I was preparing for this thing, one of the things I did was I looked up the word documentary, because this is thought of as a documentary. And what a documentary is something that emphasizes or expresses things as perceived without distortion of personal feelings, insertion of fictional matter, or interpretation. Now, no such thing ever existed. And Waiting for Superman sure wasn't it. It's an advocacy piece. And when we look at this thing, I mean, it's a morality play. It's got villains, and those are unions in public schools, unwilling to change, and it's got victims, and a lot of them are poor kids. And it's got heroes, and there are charters, and there's Finland, and there's Jeffrey Canada, and there's Michelle Rhee. All the people who were invited to write for this book turned it down, and they chose me instead after they turned it down. This thing is timely. It comes in the midst of almost 30 years of school reform. It plays on the emotions as well as the intellect. It's deeply biased. It puts a firm hand on the scale in terms of what the reforms need to be. And it's really in the same ballpark as things like Michael Moore's Bowling for Columbine and the earlier Al Gore film, and even Ed Murrow's stuff. Though having looked at you before, there probably are not a lot of you who've ever seen an Ed Murrow film. But he brought down McCarthy with something like this. And just by way of background, if you're interested in my chapter, go read it. But the reality for me is, let me see if I can put the book in context. Our nation's making a transition. And it's a transition from a national, analog, industrial economy to a global, digital information economy. And the problem is, every one of our social institutions was created for the former. So you sort of look at them and you say, you know, the schools are broken. And you know what, government's not working so well anymore. And healthcare is in trouble. And our financial institutions are really in great difficulty. And on top of that, we got problems with, media, don't understand it anymore. It seems to be falling apart. All of our newspapers seem to be in the midst of closure or merger. And what's happening as a consequence is, and by the way, nobody who's in any other industry is aware their own industry is in trouble. I once had a conversation with Mayor Giuliani. Soon after I came to Teachers College, he summoned me to City Hall. And he said, you people are doing a terrible job in education. I've been there a week. I didn't have time to do a terrible job yet. That took me years. And I finally just got so angry. And I said it very calmly. But I said, you know, your industry is in the same shape as mine. You think people in my industry aren't as good as they used to be. They're self-serving. The industry is falling apart, it's ineffective. We think the same thing about your business. And the fact of the matter is, you don't want to give us money, and we don't want to give you money. And you tell me people are withdrawing from the schools, they're going to charters, they're going to private schools, they're going to the suburbs. But we're withdrawing from government, we're not voting. And the fact of the matter is, you don't like unions, and we don't like political parties, and you don't like tenure, and we want term limits. You want some business person to run our schools, we want some business person in your job, both of which have happened since our conversation. And I left. He never invited me back to City Hall. But it's the real problem we're facing. Every institution seems to be broken right now. And the question is, how do you fix them? And we're doing two kinds of things at once. One is we're trying to repair them, and the other is we're trying to replace them. And the simple fact is, when you look at repair, what's happening now is some of the heroes of this book, people like Michelle Rhee, are taking jobs in major school systems and trying to turn them around. But we're still at a point at which we haven't been successful in turning around any urban school system in the United States in 30 years. But what's also happening is, working with the very same model, we have people who are saying, you know, we can fix that model. Maybe if we recruit teachers differently and we prepare them differently, that model will be fine. And those people are called Teacher America. And maybe if what we do is we change the governance of the schools, they'll be fine. We'll create charter schools. And there are people who are saying, let's change the calendar and let's change the curriculum, and then it'll be fine. And those people are called KIP. But something far more fundamental has happened in education. And what that is, industrial societies have one view of education. Information economies have another. The industrial societies, the epitome of industrial America is the assembly line. And our schools are sort of built like that. We take kids at age 5, we march them through 13 years of instruction, batch processing them by age. They attend 180 days a year. They take 5 major subjects for lengths of time dictated by the Carnegie Foundation in 1908. The focus in industrial societies is on fixed time and common processes. Information economies don't believe in that. What information economies say is, you know something? Time can be variable. Process can be variable. All we care about are outcomes. All we care about is learning. So where we stand right now is we're trying one other thing at the same time. And you can see examples of it all around the country. We're trying to reinvent public schooling. And you can see projects like School of One in New York City, where I live. And I was really pleased to hear in the last presentation that I was an environmentalist and had a very small carbon footprint. But what those schools are doing is they're focusing on learning, not teaching, which is a revolutionary change. It's not simply rhetoric. And what they're also doing is they're individualizing the curriculum and focusing on mastery. Students move as fast as they master the materials. The role of teacher changes. The teacher ends up being a diagnostician. What's Johnny or Mary need? The teacher ends up being a prescriptor. The teacher ends up being a teacher. The teacher ends up being an assessor. It's a very different vision of schooling. And that's the direction in which we're moving. So when one looks at this project or this movie, in some respects, maybe the biggest failing is that it's betting on a system that's not going to work. We're doing 2 kinds of change. The repair work, I can only describe as Schindler's List kind of work. We have a broken system, and what we're trying to do with it is make it better and save as many as we can while we reinvent what schooling is going to look like for the future. They're 2 critical ingredients, and charters may be a part of repair. And different organizations may be hindrances to those repairs. But at the moment, there aren't a lot of heroes, and there aren't a lot of villains in this story. We have a lot of people who are working very, very hard to try to reach solutions, either designed to save kids or reinvent schooling. And this movie comes out very, very strongly in terms of those solutions, none of which are as yet proven. And if time permits, we can talk a little bit later about the likely impact of the movie. How's that?
That's excellent. Thanks very much. It just made me think of a few things. I grew up in a city called Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. And I went to the University of Manitoba. I became a teacher in the school system there. And I'll say this, it's very hard to grow up next to the United States. It's a very difficult thing to do. because the U.S. is the U.S. And we got reminded every time the Summer Olympic Games happened. You know, the flag waving and everything else. And it's one of those things, it's easy to dislike it, but really inside of it, you're kind of jealous too, right? Because you like that flag waving, but just it's really bad that the U.S. does it. Well, I've lived in the U.S. now for 22 years. I'm a dual citizen. I just wave 2 flags now to do it. But the reason I mention this at all is that we do like to go like this, and we say we're number one. And when we're not, we like to believe that we will be again. And especially in education, those who have heard of PISA rankings, if you can call them rankings, in terms of where we are in science and literacy in the world, well, we don't do very well on that list. I believe on the math, I think we're 36 out of the world. But then the politicians get involved and they say, well, by 2020, we're going to be number one. We're not. There's just no possible human way we can be number one. And you know what? I don't know if it matters that much, but we still stress that we want to be number one. I'd be happy with us, let's be better. Yeah. How do we just become better? Now, it's interesting because if we move the shift, and the reason this book is so, not the book, but the conversation is so important in terms of the higher education dialogue we're also having here in the next several days, is because we're kind of ticked off we're not number one in higher education anymore either. And we have the president and others who are saying, well, we need to be number one again. It's not going to happen. Okay? Not in our type of society, it cannot happen. We have such a massified system of higher education that's mostly a good thing. You know, comes out of the GI Bill and many other legislative actions at the federal level and, of course, the state and local levels to a degree. But we're not South Korea. We don't have this type of way of doing things, and we're certainly not Finland. And on Saturday morning, you're going to hear from Pasi Sahlberg about what's going on in Finland. They were number one in the rankings in the PISA. Number 2, by the way, depending which way you looked at it, was Canada. Just going to say that, put that out there. But for this higher education, in terms of what we're going to do, is it that important that we have the highest attainment rates in the world? Does that really translate into the economy? And it's a yes and no proposition. You know, it is partially, it does push us. But we have to answer the much more difficult questions of why. Now, this is not at all what I was going to talk about right now, but once Dr. Levine started talking, I said, well, this kind of brings me to a different thesis on this, because we do have this dialogue of more of what and why, and we're not asking that question necessarily. And I'll talk in a breakout session tomorrow about some of the data, because I've looked at the Bureau of Labor statistics, and I'm seeing this real misconnection between what we're doing in higher education and what we're doing in the economy, and where is this nexus? So what has this got to do with the K-12 system and whether we're doing charter schools or anything else? Well, the solutions to higher education in terms of attainment and other things depend largely on what's going to happen in elementary and secondary school. You talk to the people, we had a workshop the last 2 days, our Retention 101 workshop. And in terms of increasing diversity, increasing access to college, and most importantly, increasing completion. If you ask what the 2 issues are that's stopping both access and success in college, one is financial, okay, having financial access, okay, and being able to pay the high cost of higher education. And the second thing is academic wherewithal. Okay? That happens. And this isn't about passing the buck. Matter of fact, I've read this in your study. You've talked about this in your work with looking at teacher preparation programs. and said, we can't just pass the buck, say it's high school's fault, because higher education trains all the administrators and trains all the teachers. So there's a shared responsibility here. But I think the challenge is if we don't do more at the elementary and secondary level, we can't solve these other conditions and other issues that happen in higher education. So those are my new comments based on Finding Superman that have little to do with the book, but I think they get at the larger issue of what we do.
Do you know what? I'm going to disagree with, if you'll let me.
Sure, because I control the mics.
Oh, okay.
So please do.
I'm going to say it really matters whether we're number one. And number one can be number 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. But the reality is the industrial society and the success of industrial societies was driven by natural resources and capital. If you didn't have natural resources and you didn't have capital, you didn't succeed as an industrial nation. During that era, what we did as a nation, we were China. We stole from Western Europe every technological innovation. And we created our first factories, and we created steam engines, and we created trains based on their models. And by the 1850s, we were moving ahead of them. Where we stand right now is we live in a society, we live in a nation in which, and it came through very clearly in the last presentation, in which our future is tied to the quality of human capital. I took my board to visit Finland, and we met with people from the prime minister through teachers. And my favorite comment was from our guide, who was this very straight-laced woman, probably in her 50s. And I turned to her and said, they were very proud of everything they'd done. And I said, what would you do if next year on PISA, you guys finish 57th, your scores plummeted? And she looked at me and she said, it would be sucking. And she's exactly right. The reality is for us, our kids aren't competing. The kid from Bloomfield Hills and the kid from Scarsdale and the kid from Potomac aren't competing against each other. They're competing against kids from China and India and Hong Kong and Singapore for the same jobs. And the people who are going to get those jobs and the societies that are going to advance most quickly are those which have done the best job of preparing human capital. And that means not only being able to score well on those tests, but it means creativity, it means continuous learning, and it means critical thinking, and a whole set of what are called 21st century skills. But we need them all if we're going to be able to compete in that international marketplace. And that's where the competition among nations is going to be. It's going to be economic. The other phenomenon is, and you all know these things, there are no jobs for people who don't have high school diplomas. The fact of the matter is, once upon a time, dropouts were part of the cost of doing business in higher education, in K-12 education. And that was fine, because there used to be jobs for high school dropouts. You get a job working in a manufacturing plant. Those plants are in other countries now, and so are those jobs. So we need more education in order to be successful with the populations for which we've been least successful so far. And the educational system needs to be stronger for them. The interesting phenomenon for me right now, Woodrow Wilson has a series of programs. State by state, we're working to try to transform teacher education. So what we end up doing is going into a state and creating a coalition. And the coalition ends up being the governor, the chief state school officer, the state higher education executive officer, legislators on both sides of the aisle, universities, schools, unions, philanthropy, stakeholders who are unique to that state. And part of what I was worried about, part of the reason for the coalition is continuity. Programs die when they're based in one office holder at a group of institutions. Somebody leaves and the program's over. But if you can build the coalition, people leave and it continues. My biggest fear was, because we're in Ohio and because we're in Michigan, they went from blue to red in their governorships. And the surprise to me came in that there was no difference in terms of the agenda that each put forward. They put in different policies, but the key agenda is economic development, and education is a key part of that. If you look at the Obama agenda in education, let's see, it's charters, it's pay for performance, it's accountability, it's data. And you say, wait, I knew people who used to have that platform. They were called Republicans. The fact of the matter is both parties are talking the same language these days. The two areas in which I think I see differences are these. One is unions. Republicans trash them in public, and Democrats do it in private. And the other, vouchers. But beyond that, they're talking a lot of the same kind of language. And what it all comes back to is human capital being the answer for tomorrow. And if we can't succeed in doing a good job in producing that capital, we will sink as a nation, not as measured by PISA, but in terms of our capacity to generate industry, to sustain industry, to build industry, to build an economic platform. Right now, in every major city in the country, there are thousands of jobs that are going unfilled in a bad economy because we don't have the trained labor force to fill those jobs. So long as those jobs stay empty, economic development won't hit the peaks that are possible. And I'd add one more item. Last summer, Guatemala was holding a presidential election, and the State Department sent me to Guatemala to brief their presidential candidates, because ironically, for a nation that has an average of a fourth grade education, education wasn't one of the items being discussed by presidential candidates. What's going to happen is, I ran into a banker there, and what the banker said was, we have a program. We're going to teach as many kids as we can in Guatemala Chinese. And I thought that's absolutely brilliant. They're also competing with us, fourth grade education. They're competing with us for technical assistance. So when you call up to explain that your computer is not working and you need help, you may not get that person in Detroit, and you may not get that person in Washington, D.C., and you may not get that person in Chicago, but you may get that person in Guatemala. The fact is, third world countries, developing nations, whatever it is we choose to call them, have a huge advantage. What they don't have is the infrastructure we've built. Infrastructure is a curse in some ways. What it defines is the kind of program that you have and have to change, as opposed to having no program at all and being able to build from scratch. So we're going to be able to see, or we're going to see, not only competition from Finland and Singapore and Hong Kong and China, but from Guatemala and it's a lot of its peers. Long answer to a short question.
That's right. You know, it made me think back in that great decade, the 80s, when I was growing up. I was a musician in a former life, and I was trying to get airplay and trying to get play in the bars and things like that. And I thought my competition were the local people and Bryan Adams and people like that. And my producer said to me, he said, "That's not your competition." He said, "Your competition is Paul McCartney." He said, "Your competition is this new band called U2." Yeah, that dates me a little bit right there. The point being that...
I don't want to play this game with you.
That's right. But the point being just this, you are correct about the competition. The question is, are we focused on being number one, or are we focused on getting a whole lot better than we are, and where we rank, we rank? We can't solve that right now. We'll have a dialogue after, and Dr. Levine will also be back for our later session on the future of higher education. We do not have time right now for a question. Okay, Ben, what is it?
Wall Street Journal.
Excuse me, Wall Street Journal. Better yet, you've also been that organ of the far right. You've also been extremely critical of teacher ed schools, quite rightly in my view. So my point there is it just seems to me that you could easily be caricatured unfairly as a Michelle Rhee, but you're not. And Michelle Rhee, I think, is a serious person. But the second point is I think there's a false dichotomy you've created between the charter school advocates on the one hand, the people who fight teachers' unions, and what you view as a more fundamental overhaul of education, focusing on not worrying about traditional pathways, focusing on results, being willing to rethink credit hours, being willing to look at customized learning and technology. Those are all great things. But those are precisely what charter schools have been leading the way on. If you look at rocket ship learning, if you look at KIP, these are all places that are precisely premised on the idea that we don't care about how you get there. We care about results, and we're willing to experiment. We're not bound by the strictures of the union contract, etc. So it seems to me the two things that you set up in opposition are in fact two things that can work very well together.
And I think we disagree. And on two grounds. One ground is in the education wars, right against left, liberals against conservatives. I view myself as a conscientious objector, which is show me anything that works, and I'll be out there tomorrow campaigning to have it adopted. If you can convince me that having wands in schools works, I'll be there campaigning to have wands in schools. So that I think ideology does not work. I think it does more damage to kids than research does in focusing on learning. In terms of schools, I don't see charters as a silver bullet. They have the capacity to create things that haven't been created. They also have the capacity to mirror things that have been created and failed. And the research that we've seen on charters so far shows some wonderful successes and some horrible failures. So that when they're good, they are really, really good. And when they're bad, they are horrid. So, coming back a second, I guess I do see a real conflict. And the conflict is, and it's creating one of the problems today, which is we're trying to impose two systems simultaneously on schools. One is we're trying to impose the industrial model, fixed time, still 12 years, still focusing on teaching. And we're also telling them, okay, doing those things, fix the time, fix the teaching. Now we want you to do is achieve outcomes for all children. We can't hold the process constant and the outcomes constant. One's going to have to give way over time. And what I'm arguing is the process is going to have to give way over time. We're not ready to do it yet. We're experimenting with the alternative. We'll get there by successive approximations, continuing iterations of what that school looks like. We'll end up scaling it up as we get closer to it. One of the things I'd love to see us do is a Manhattan Project that focuses on creating the school of tomorrow, because we all know what it looks like today. And why wait for decades to create it? We can put in intensive effort and do it now. So, yeah, Ben, I think we do disagree.
All right. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this session. Again, thanks to Lee Fisher and Arthur Levine. Let's give them a hand, please.
And you!
Thank you.